Hello and welcome, Semhal. And I think this is your first time on Tagat. So thank you very much for making the time.
Thank you for having me.
How are you? How are you feeling?
I'm very well. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right. I'm all right. This has been a long time in the planning, so I'm so happy that we have managed to make it happen today.
Mhm.
We're going to talk about Tigray related and the Ethiopia related issues. A lot to get through. But how is the experience of the aftermath of the war of Tigray? How are you feeling generally?
Um, huh. how am I feeling generally? I am slightly despondent, um, slightly disheartened, perhaps disillusioned, but in fighting spirits.
Yeah, and yeah, and you've been fighting. Well, one thing that I found interesting about you generally when I do my preparations for interview with people from Tigray, I go to YouTube to listen to what they have said in the past because generally in Tigray is an oral tradition. People don't write, but in your case, actually, I was blessed with a lot of material that you have written. So in that sense, it was a break from tradition. It looks like that you are more into participating in the political discourse through writing. Is that something that you are conscious of, or is something that just happens subliminally?
I mean, I think there's that old saying, I have a face for radio and a voice for TV. And don't even think my voice is great for TV. So I tend to write. I tend to, and that's my preferred form of expression. Yes, writing is my preferred form of intervention in general. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But is that something that you notice as well when you, for instance, when you look for material to reference in your writing? Do you generally struggle to find written material on Tigray related stuff, or is that a problem that I'm exaggerating?
Um, I think, well, there's really a huge, I've been very fortunate, and very lucky in that I was able to help set up an archive through the Mendes Foundation. Um, and that process of setting up the archive really allowed me to read a huge amount of material, gave me access to, I think that's been a great privilege in my life, is the access that I had to a huge amount of written material, in particular on Tigray, but also on Ethiopia. I think that's been a great, yeah, that's been a great privilege. So I haven't had that much trouble in that sense. But I do see that there is a dearth of obviously public scholarship and so on Tigray and by Tigrayans, I think also. I think we tend to focus on the scholarship that the people who study us
Yeah.
than um, rather than how we study ourselves, I suppose. Or yeah, perhaps I'm not being very articulate. No, I haven't had much trouble. I think one of the great traditions that TPLF had was, in fact, knowledge production, right? And that comes out of things like the student movement. Also, I think that's perhaps not so much the case now, but there, at least in terms of the nation state of Tigray, not the kingdom Tigray, I think, and its formation has been actually really well documented through the TPLF, I think, through TPLF documents and so on. There's, you know, novels and it's not just documents in the sense of, party policy or program and so on. But there's a huge amount of cultural production too, that I had the great privilege of collecting and um, and curating, and that gave me the opportunity to read many things, and I'm very grateful for that.
Well, and I think I found you to be a wonderful writer, very, very enjoyable to read. Some
Thank
of your
you.
turn of phrases have made me laugh. Yesterday, I was literally laughing at some of the things you said. I think one thing I sent you in our private text messages, or with that, you described the shift in Ethiopia from one that advocates for social justice to eschatology, and that was just something that made me laugh. And I think there was another where you said that you attended a conference. I think it would have been in 2014, in your capacity at the walking stick of Indras Eshete. So I think you have a
Yes.
wonderful way of writing, a sense
Well,
of humor, sometimes outright funny.
that's a point of fact. I was in
Yeah.
Dresser walking stick that for many years. Also one of the great privileges of my life was um, being employed as his walking stick was perhaps one of the greatest privileges of my life. I learned a great deal from him, from his approach to scholarship, but also to life. Um, it, yeah, so that was a point of fact. That wasn't a turn of phrase as such.
Yeah, but I'm speaking of Indras Eshete. Is it fair to say that you looked up to him? It looks like that you have taken a lot of inspiration from his thoughts and writings and stuff like that. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. I
Mm.
think it's fair to say that um, he is. I mean, he's never given me formal instruction as such. Um, but he just being around him has allowed me, I mean, just in terms of the books that he suggests you read, the conversations that you engage in with him, he is a huge inspiration to me. Very much a friend, a companion also, um, but a mentor as well.
Hmm. I wouldn't say I have read a lot of material written by him, but I think I must have read one or two articles by him. And a lot of people say that he's a person of principles, and he thinks deeply about a lot of issues. But unfortunately, he hasn't been given that much of sort of the respect and space to express his ideas in Ethiopia, especially lately. I don't know how that makes him feel now. But that's what I think.
Mm, I don't know. That's not something that I want to
Mm.
address. But I would suggest that well, not recently, I read for the first time his PhD thesis last year, The Social Structure of Freedom. And that piece of writing blew my mind, to
Mm.
be perfectly honest. I'd suggest I can send it to you. I'd suggest you read that. He has several other, I think people tend to focus on the papers that he's written in terms of kind of current events in Ethiopia, and not so much focus is given to his work in philosophy, which is really quite remarkable. Um, I mean, I think his best known paper is on fraternity, but
Fraternity. Mm.
yeah, but I was really taken aback by the social structure of freedom and the arguments he makes in that, which really anticipate, to be honest, things like the developmental state. This paper was written in the 70s, I think 1970. Um, and what it does is make an argument for a nation state in the first instance, and then a nation state that cares about the poor in the second. And the way he makes that argument is, to me, really quite remarkable. So I'd suggest if you're interested in reading
Mm.
his work, I'd suggest those texts, and
Yeah,
I can
definitely.
perhaps suggest more.
Yeah, I would love
Yeah.
to. Yeah, I think we're going to. speak about the nation state and your arguments for it, because it is something that you have thought a lot about and you have written a lot about yourself. But staying on the issue of writing for a little while, there's something
Not
in you.
not not quite in the same way as Andreas Shete, I must
We will
say.
see. We will see. Let the listeners be the judge. But in terms of the
I'm
way you
telling you.
write, in terms of the way you write, there's something that is reminiscent of Meles's prose as well in the way that you write. Do you think you have been influenced by? Of course, inevitably you will be influenced by that sort of father figure. But is this something that you consciously try to imitate or something like that?
I no, not consciously, but I mean, I was very close to my father. And obviously as a father figure, I think he informed how I think about things or how to, yeah, I think he also didn't do it in like Andreas, he didn't really give me formal instruction as such, but just conversations over lunch or over dinner and I do he really did craft the way that I think or
Yeah.
how I approach a particular issue or how to think about things. I think the greatest thing he did for me was, well, he did many great things for me, but um, one of them is just giving me an approach to dealing with problems or to think of how to think about certain things or just, you know, um, but consciously, no, I don't imitate him consciously.
Mm.
Um, but subconsciously for sure. I'm sure there are a lot of similarities there. And he did spend a great deal of time with all of his children in terms of forming forming our forming how we think about things. He'd and he'd give me, he'd give me books to read. Also, he was very generous in that way in terms of giving you time for conversation and giving you time for thinking through things and giving you the space to think through things. He wasn't very he didn't like to tell me what to think, but he did teach me how to think about things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, in the very, very unlikely event that there is someone listening to us who doesn't know you, you are the daughter of Meles Zenawi, of course, but I would presume everybody knows that. But you are here in your own right and not on behalf of Meles. And I'm not going to ask you to defend or anything of that sort. But I think one thing about Meles, he was a deeply private person, and not many of us know what kind of dynamic he had with you, with his children. What was it like? I think it must have been fascinating to have an intellectual discussion and debate and argument with him. Would that sort of dynamic that you had?
I mean, like you said, he was a deeply private person, and I don't want to start invading his privacy now. I will say he was exceptionally loving. Um, he was very funny. Um, so I think I'm perhaps one of the things I miss the most is just watching the news with him and the running commentary he would give, the wit and so on. Um, that's one of the things I really miss. I'll look at something or watch something. I'm like, I wonder what joke he'd crack about this. Um, but yeah, without invading his privacy too much. He was exceptionally loving, and I think actually, I will say, particularly for a Tigrayan man and for a young Tigrayan woman, the
Yeah.
amount of freedom and independence he gave me. And I now looking back, I realize just how special that was in that sense. he was very encouraging of all of his children, but in particular his daughters. We were given a kind of we were allowed many things that I don't necessarily see women or other fathers in my culture giving their daughters.
Well, it was very important of me to try to stick my nose into your private affairs, but I think we have scooped a lot of information. But I think it's a wonderful thing that you're writing. I'm so happy. I think other people should follow you. So you follow your inspiration in terms of putting your ideas in writing. Even for me, preparing for this interview, it has made life very, very easy when material is written. It's a wonderful thing. So thank you for that. And another thing about you writing is that you're very perceptive. I could see that you observe even the tiniest of details. And for that sort of writer, I wonder how it makes you feel to see what is happening in Tigray now, the Tigray politics, which from where I am sitting is a complete shambles. What do you think is happening now?
I mean, one of the reasons I prefer writing is I'm not a very good speaker. So
Well, I'm
that's,
not sure about
you
that,
know,
but all right.
in terms of, I mean, which Tigrayan, which crisis, which part of the political mess would you like to talk about? I think you
I
need to
don't know. I
specify.
think generally, the sense you get if you speak to people who are interested in and engaged in the Tigray affair, the one common sense you get is that people have sort of they feel depressed. There is nobody who thinks that there is a pathway that is being followed. There is some direction into which the Tigray is being pulled. All you see is just bickering over completely petty matters and stuff like that. And I wonder, I don't know, because one of the things that I sense in your writing is that you tend to see the assumptions behind what politicians are doing, the theory that is driving them, and stuff like that. And if you see a method to them, to what appears to be madness on the face of it.
Do I see method to madness? No, I don't see method to madness. It, I mean, if you're asking me in particular about the bickering going on now, um, I in some ways I'm not fully certain of what we are bickering about, to
Yeah,
be perfectly honest.
yeah, maybe to sort
And
of
that's
yeah,
when I
to
say that, I don't think either side has articulated in a way that makes sense to me what the stakes are.
yeah.
In, and nobody has really articulated. For instance, I still don't know what the legal ramifications are, for instance, in of re-registering or I nobody has made that clear to me. I don't know if other people know, but I haven't. I don't understand what ramifications we are trying to avoid. Um, I don't particularly understand um, what the tensions around the Congress are on the surface. I do think that there seems to be clearly a difference in approach um, in interpretation of what the Pretoria Agreement means. I think that one of the arguments that I tried to make in the paper in both in Dirge and in the interview with Mehdi, which you mentioned to me before the interview, before this interview.
Yes.
Yeah, I tried to make the point that I think one of the greatest pitfalls of the Pretoria Agreement was that it gave away the organizing principle of Tigrayan resistance, which was the elected government, right? So that's kind of the umbrella under which we had all gathered. Um, so by giving away that, by removing the organizing principle of the resistance, it was inevitable that it would be disbanded. This is the kind of factionalization that we're seeing now. Not just in terms of TPLF. People pick up less, but even within the opposition parties. So you've had, for instance, Tigray Independence Party has lost most of its leadership, if I'm not mistaken. There's been infighting, if I'm not mistaken, within Salsa Wayana and so on. So it's not necessarily a TPLF only phenomenon. Obviously, the weight that TPLF carries within Tigray and the political space in Tigray means that we pay more attention to the TPLF, and rightly so. But the dispersal of Tigrayan resistance, to me, really emanates from the fact that we gave up our organizing principle. The political premise of resistance was given away. So in that sense, it's not surprising that there's factionalization. What is, I think, problematic, hugely problematic, is that we're now losing people don't take the TPLF very seriously. They tend to think of it as just like a monolith, and but the party cites the CC, the Congress, even the executive committee. These are sites for political contestation, right? So, and sites for legitimate political contestation, and sites for conflict resolution, most importantly, right? So if you now don't have these spaces for political contestation and conflict resolution, what then happens? How do you then solve them? I think in some ways, a lot of Tigrayan commentators tend to project the future into the present, in the sense that we pretend that we have all of these liberal institutions. Like, we're going to get rid of TPLF, and then suddenly we're going to have all like these great opposition parties, and it's all going to be liberal democracy. And that's not how that works, right? That's not how institution building works. You don't have the environment, which was always the argument for the developmental state, is that it was never that we are democratic, is that we are trying to democratize. We're trying to create the institutions that allow for democracy to flourish, including things like creating a middle class, right? That has access to newspapers, that is able to get information from many different sources, and so on. To create the kind of institutions that allow for an informed citizenry, that has trust in its public institutions. And in Tigray, what we did have was a huge amount of trust in our public institutions. What we've lost over the course of this war is that trust. The trust, and that's incredibly dangerous in terms of where we go from here. Both in like the loss of trust in the public institutions and the loss of legitimate sites for political contestation and conflict resolution. Those two things, I think, are hugely dangerous, because what that does then is invite or make us vulnerable to other forms of conflict resolution. And picking up guns, for instance, which I think everybody would like to avoid. And I hope that our leadership is sober enough to do that.
Yeah. Well, you say that one of the ramifications of the Pretoria Agreement was that the organizing principle was taken away, the elected government, and that is a good point. Another point you make in that article is that in fundamental ways, Tigrayan politics is not different from Ethiopian politics. So all the things that we see in Ethiopian politics, the horse trading, the sense of rent seeking and all that, it is a common feature in Tigray as well. It's just that it has been obscured by a lot of other things, the war and other things. But now the Pretoria Agreement has made it apparent and accentuated the tension that had already been there. I think that's another point you make. And of course, now Tigray is operating within Ethiopian, within the context of Ethiopian politics. I think Yosef Gebrehewot, I don't know if you know him, is a very astute commentator, said that Tigray is now a failed state within a failed state, which is uh, which is a damning verdict to say. So you have that on the one hand, and you also have that, people like you. I think I have seen somewhere written that you're pushing for the liberation of Tigray. So what would that mean in the current context, fighting for the liberation of Tigray? And I think earlier you mentioned that the independence movement has sort of gone out of fashion. So
No, I said that I think that there are. I didn't mean to say that the independence movement had gone out of fashion. What I was saying was that the Tigray Independence Party had lost its leadership.
Mhm.
And you see the kind of infighting that you see in the TPLF, also in the other opposition parties. So the point I was trying to make with that is that I see the issue really as an issue of the political set in Tigray versus just the TPLF. This isn't to say that the TPLF isn't participating in these issues or isn't clearly the most influential, but the point I was trying to make is it's a wider problem than just the TPLF. Um, we have, at, you know, as far as I can tell, the vast majority of scholars, what people like to refer to as the elite, um, are really comprador elites, right? And going back to the point of a failed state within a failed state, one of the things, even within the independence movement, one of the things that you'd have to think about in terms of sovereignty, because what's happening with the failed state in the failed state is that you have the political economy that's emerging, for instance, with the gold trading. What you have is securitized pockets of extraction that then connect directly to global capital without the mediation of the nation state, right? Without the mediation of the state. So in that situation, what does sovereignty really mean? Becomes a question. And that becomes a question whether Tigray is part of Ethiopia or whether it's independent. You first have to define what sovereignty means in relationship to global capital. Um, and I think that those are not the types of conversations that we're having. In many cases, the independence movement, I think, is used to obscure rather than illuminate a lot of issues. It tends to be used um, emotively rather than intellectually. Um, uh, and I think, honestly speaking, I think any kind of nationalism without some sort of class allegiance tends to just lead to fascism, right? If it's not grounded in some sort of class politics, also, it tends to veer off to the populist right. And I do think that a big chunk of the Tigray independence movement has really been about jingoism on an empty stomach. Um, and we need to think through what sovereignty means in order to then understand what independence would do or not do for the people of Tigray. And that has to be the deciding thing, right? The to me, I'm not particularly into nationalism in that way, of any kind. I'm not a flag waving nationalist of any kind. What I do have, though, is solidarity with the people of Tigray. And when I say the people of Tigray, I do not mean the businessmen. I do not mean the politicians. That's not who I have allegiance with. I do not have allegiance with the Tigrayan elite. I couldn't care less about the Tigrayan elite, to be perfectly honest. Um, as far, like I said, it's really a very parasitic elite, um, very problematic elite. but I have a huge amount of allegiance with the farmers of Tigray, or I have solidarity, I should say, with the farmers of Tigray, and that's the Tigrayan I care about. I don't particularly care about the kind of new urban elite emerging in places like Mekelle and Shira and so on. That's not. I don't have a political allegiance with that crowd.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, somehow, and the class struggle, the class conception of everything is also something that you have written a lot about. There's a very infamous remark by a top-ranking TPLF official. I forgot the name. Um, he once said that the TPLF has as much allegiance to the Tigrayan farmers as it has to Somalian farmers and to other farmers, and that was his way of saying that it's the class that matters to him, not the ethnicity or other other parameters of allegiance. And a lot of people, especially now after the war, are very critical of that sort of view. People say that the reason why Tigray was completely unprepared to defend itself against the war that happened was because it was exposed. Special attention wasn't given to Tigrayans because the TPLF wasn't really especially interested in Tigray, even though it purportedly represented Tigray in the federal government. I don't know if my point is very clear.
Mm.
Samad.
Um, I mean, I tend to think that that's kind of well, let me put it this way. I've heard a lot of people talk about TPLF's internationalism, quote unquote, which is I think what you're referring to in
Yep.
terms of, you know, if whether you're a farmer in Mexico or you're a farmer in Tigray, your interests remain the
Yeah.
same. Um, that's not the same as saying that having solidarity with, say, farmers in Nicaragua or in Palestine, um, or saying that they have similar interests. For instance, let's take the issue of climate change, right? That is an issue that deeply affects the Tigrayan farmer. It is not an issue that can be solved at the Tigray scale on its own, right? That's not an issue that we can deal with as just Tigray. So I think there's a more nuanced approach that we can take than I generally see from what I would describe as right-wing Tigrayan elites. Um, I think one of the funny things about their positions is you also ask for a huge amount of international solidarity. We've asked for a huge amount of, not that we've received it, but we've asked for a huge amount of international solidarity, right? So there was this whole like UN only for Tigray, you know, that's you asking for some kind of solidarity. And you have to be able to then give that kind of solidarity to receive it. Um, and it's not possible to live in isolation behind your mountains in perpetuity, you know. Um, so I don't fault the
Well,
TPLF.
but to cut you off, somehow, I know
Yeah.
I think I hear you. I think people wouldn't disagree with that in terms of showing solidarity to, to people, whether they are in Mexico or in Nicaragua or other countries. I think that's not the point. Is that if you are a political party that represents Tigray, your
If you're
primary.
asking
Mhm.
if I think let me put if I'm understanding your question correctly, what you're saying is what is the rationale for Tigray having remained in a federated Ethiopia?
Yeah.
Is really what you're
Yep.
asking if I
Yep.
if I
Yep.
if
Yep.
if I
That's
get you
right.
correctly.
That's
Yeah.
right.
And I think the rationale for that is that there are bigger empires in the world than Ethiopia, bigger, much more powerful empires in the world than Ethiopia. And the way that you deal, again, this has goes back to the global capital issue. Um, how you could your ability to stand up to global capital as Tigray is not the same as your ability to stand up to global capital as Ethiopia. So, or as in fact, even as Ethiopia, even as Africans continentally, it's not necessarily that we have a great leverage in terms of global capital. So I think that was the rationale. Is Yeah, I think that was the rationale. The rationale was that in order to deal with greater global forces, it made sense at the time to be part of a bigger whole. If that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but it's connected to one of your views, as I understood from your writing, and maybe you'll correct me, is that the main cause of the war, of the genocidal war, is not cultural factors, which is what many people tend to think, that the reason why it was easy for Abiy Ahmed to rally a lot of people around his very nefarious intention to suppress the crime. The reason why it was easy for him was because there was a ethnic based hatred towards the Tigrans, and he was able to marshal that power. A lot of people say that, but you seem to say that actually there were more structural and economic factors rather than the cultural ones. Am I right?
That's not quite what I was trying to say. I will say that I think this is something that a piece of writing that I'm working on now in terms of historiography and why Tigrayans have been depicted in particular ways in Ethiopian historiography, what sort of the historiography of the imperial state versus the historiography of the student movement and what that has meant in terms of propagating particular stereotypes, not clearly, not just of Tigrayans, but I think in terms of Tigrinya speakers, obviously because Eritrea was at that point a part of, during Haile Selassie, a part of Ethiopia, a lot of the anxiety, in fact, the anxiety that drove kind of the hateful narratives within Ethiopian historiography was of actually Eritrean separation, right? That was the anxiety of the imperial state. And there are very particular ways in which Tigrinya speakers have been associated with the modernizing project, if that makes sense. So Tigrinya speakers were hugely influential in the labor movement, hugely influential in the student movement, and so on. So there's a way in which the kind of there's been an association of Tigrinya speakers with a modernizing project that, which is what, like, this whole, we're going to go back to imperial, and it also exists in Tigray, right? We're going to go back to like Kingdom Tigray. We're going to go back to Kingdom Ethiopia or Empire Ethiopia, whatever. And I that's really an anti-modern, and comes from as much from a postmodern disposition as it does from a desire for tradition, I think, particularly in scholarship. But I think there's been a particular association. I think there has clearly been pent-up hatred. What I was trying to say about the political economy part of it is that there are what allowed for that hatred to kind of erupt in that way is a political economy issue. It's the same, like, why in the reason that working class white people would vote for Trump even though it's against, in fact, their own interests, right? Or why right-wing populism works anywhere. It tends to be economic factors, right? It's the fact that manufacturing left the US and that the poor white people have had a really hard time of it. Right? And I think that also holds true in Ethiopia. I think there was increasing inequality, hugely increasing inequality, not within regions, between regions, and that can create tensions. I think that can not just allow for right-wing populism to take hold, but also for reversals in nation building, which I think is another hugely dangerous aspect of the crisis in Tigray today. What we would refer to as Aurajawnet, which really, to me, this is TPLF's current crisis. To me, really reminds me of 69. I'm speaking in our calendar, rather than, let's say, the split of the 70s or the 90s. We've really gone back that far, right? So it's really a reversal in nation building. There are reversals in nation building. And if you don't have a political economy approach, one of the huge dangers is that you tend not to view, or you tend to obscure these reversals in nation building. And then you can't deal with them, right? So that's to me the major issue.
If you can sum up, you'll have. I'll ask you to either move a little bit back or move the camera a little bit up, because
Oh, sorry.
yeah.
Sorry. Okay.
All right. Yeah. Now it's all fine. So you say in one of the article, in terms of the reversal of the nation building process, you say that the Ethiopian government started to implement economic reforms that were not compatible with the federal structure that was instituted in 1991, and you say that those policies started under the premiership of Haile Mariam, with Arkaba Okwai playing a significant role in terms of crafting the economic policy. What are those changes? Because one of the points you make is that the new reform, the so-called economic reform introduced to Ethiopia a couple of weeks ago, maybe we'll come to that later if you have time, it was something that had been on the making for a long time. And I think you start at the 2010 mark. What were those changes in terms of the policy change from the developmental state to what you consider was significantly different from that?
Well, in that paper, what I try and do is trace the liberalization process from sort of the mid 80s till the 2010s, through the various phases of liberalization, right? So it doesn't start in 2010 at all. You in fact have complete capitulation by the socialist government of the Dirge to the IMF in 1985. So you had when EPRDF came in 1991, you already had some reforms taking place in Ethiopia. So I try and trace through the various liberalization periods. The argument that I was trying to make in terms of the difference between the liberalization of the 90s, the liberalization of the early 2000s, versus the liberalization that took place in the 2010s, is that the liberalization of the 2010s didn't take into consideration, as you were saying, the structure of the federal Ethiopian state. The reason for that is the assumption. There are various assumptions. In fact, one of the interesting things about Ethiopia's turn to neoliberalism, including the TPLF's turn to neoliberalism, is that the neoliberal party seems to be over, right? We're joining it once it's gone. We're arriving at the party too
When
late.
everyone had left the party.
Party, yeah, in that sense. I remember, I think it was maybe 2018 or so, Francis Fukuyama came to deliver a lecture. And it was really viewed as kind of the final nail on the developmental state's coffin. What was funny about that lecture is he in fact said the reverse, right? He said there were heroic assumptions that neoliberalism made, particularly about developing nations, but also impacting now developed nations, right? Mature democracies and so on. And one of those heroic assumptions is of a nation building process that is complete, if that makes sense. Like, it assumes that there is a unified national identity. So the policies that were implemented by the EPRDF in the 2010s assumed that we had a unified nation state. In fact, one of the interesting things, I think Made in Africa, Arkaba identifies the Ethio-Eritrea War as, if I'm not, it's been a long time since I read that book, I may be mistaken, but identifies the Ethio-Eritrea War as kind of the moment that Ethiopian nation building was complete, right? That's problematic for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons it's problematic is nation building is not a static process; it's a dynamic process. So nation building can be reversed, as I was mentioning, and I'd like to keep saying that I think the biggest danger now facing Tigray is a reversal in the Tigrayan nation building process. Whether that Tigrayan nation is independent or within the Ethiopian state, it is a nation nonetheless. And it very likely that we're going to see huge reversals in that process. But going back to the 2010s, that is one of the assumptions. One of the heroic assumptions is that there is a unified national identity. We clearly don't have that in Ethiopia. And I don't think those policies took that into consideration. What Fukuyama said, which was interesting to me also, if I'm not, he said at that point they were still, it was the presidential, they had, it was, I think, Elizabeth Warren. It was about to be presidential elections in the States. And he mentioned that a number of the Democratic candidates were going towards something that seemed like developmentalism, right? So you have now Biden economics, which is really about state intervention. They're going back towards, industrial policy of a certain kind, relief of student loans and so on. So it's interesting that we've decided we're going to join this party, even when Fukuyama is saying it's over, It's now been, what, 20 years since Alan Greenspan and George Bush came out and said we have an ideological problem after the financial crisis. So why we would think that it's now going to work is not clear to me. I think it is indicative of an elite that has no ideas. Yeah.
What, if you were to sort of steal man Archivist's argument, if you were to ask him why was it that you thought that was a good move, for instance, to just play the devil's advocate for a moment, what do you think he would say?
I'm not a mind reader. You'd have to ask him.
All right. Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah, but you're going to do the same thing you did with the camera. I think you have an
Oh,
interesting.
sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fine. All right. Good. Yes. I was going to. Not. I mean the move to neoliberal policies has now been complete, as you will have heard on the news. The Prosperity Party have accepted all the package in its entirety, and I think, I mean, people, including me, don't really understand what the implications are of the new macro economic policy, as they call them. What are they? If you could just elucidate the main sort of features of them for our listeners, what do they amount to?
In some ways, I think at this point, the selling off of particular assets or, the liberalization of the capital markets and so on is kind of a distraction from the kind of capitalism that is emerging in Ethiopia and in Tigray. It goes back to what I was saying about sovereignty and its relationship to global capital. So what you're seeing really is the emergence of this is not let me put it this way. If Arkeva's thing was really about the islands, what the World Bank and IMF refer to as islands of success, sort of islands of excellence and so on. What we now have is islands of extraction, securitized islands of extraction. We're seeing this with gold in Tigray in a very major way. You're also seeing it in places like Walaga, where there is essentially, the bypassing of the nation state as a mediator to global capital. And it's just the role of the nation state in this way. And I think Eleni Zaleka makes this point, Santi makes this point wonderfully. The role of the nation state really becomes the role of a security company, right? And not necessarily security in the old sense, where it's like a public good that, the police for. I mean, one of the interesting things about just how neoliberal the TPLF got, and particularly during the siege period, was the disbandment of the police, right? Even the most of neoliberal states says that, there are certain public goods, security being one of them, and the protection of private property being a major part of that. So that for the Tigrayan nation state to say that actually we're not going to provide security even, right, is really it's mind-boggling how you become like it's like how you become a bigger believer, like more holy than the Pope in that sense. More, do you know what I mean? More neoliberal than the World Bank in that sense. More
Yeah.
neoliberal than the
Well, I
IMF.
texted you. I
Yeah.
texted you yesterday. Sorry to cut you off, but I texted you yesterday somehow saying that you tend to over intellectualize things that most probably a case of stupid people doing stupid stuff, and you slightly disagreed with me. And I wonder if, for instance, the disbanding of the police and all that was a carefully thought out thing, or it was just a case of people being stupid. I don't know.
I feel like this is a trap. I feel like you're asking me to call people stupid.
Well, I mean, by all means, I would welcome that. It would make me feel happy.
I won't disagree with you. I'll say that.
All right.
I
Yeah.
don't disagree that that may be part of the problem.
That's a
No,
very
no,
diplomatic
no.
way of saying that.
Um, I do think that it is ideologically driven.
Hmm.
People forget when this, I think it was like 2017, 20, around then when this Politburo was formed, when this CC, now what we now refer to as the Makata CC, was formed. They were formed under the mantle of Loti, right? Whatever Loti means, or whatever it came to mean. One of the interesting things about people saying now, for instance, we're going to change leadership, but we're not going to change program is which program, right? That's one of my questions is what program are we talking about? Is it the program that you said you were going to change in 2017? Is it the program that you started implementing in 2010? Is it the program from, or the 2010s? Is it is it the revolutionary democracy of the early 90s? Like, which program are we actually talking about? Is to me a very serious question. I'm not sure which program. Um, so I do think it is ideologically driven in that this was consciously a liberalizing or neoliberalizing CC, right? With or without war, with or without genocide, this was consciously a neoliberalizing CC, the neoliberalizing TPLF. So I do think a lot of the actions are ideologically driven. Now, the fact that they think that this ideology in 2024, that neoliberalism could work, may mean they're stupid.
Well, I mean,
May.
yeah, but even if we were to be generous and assume that they were not stupid, for instance, and given that we said Tigray is now a failed state within a failed state, and given that Ethiopia has accepted the neoliberal prescriptions wholesale. Is there something that a competent politician, for instance, in Tigray, could do differently to sort of lessen the impact of neoliberalism, or are we condemned now to accepting everything that comes from Addis Ababa, which is something that would have come from Washington?
I think Kerala in India is a very good example of how something like that could be managed. Um, India is also a federation. Modi has very many similarities with Abiy in terms of his populism, in terms of the political project he's implementing, and so on. Kerala has done very well in terms of social protections, in terms of poverty alleviation, in terms of expanding education, in terms of healthcare, and so on. So I think there are cases we could look at to learn from. I But it has to become a concern first and foremost, right? It has to be something that we wish to address and want to talk about. And one of my major criticisms of the independence movement is that it tends to um, obscure these kinds of discussion, right? Like it becomes we're going to be independent and everything is going to be solved, rather than if we were like, what are the costs and benefits of becoming independent to our ability to alleviate poverty, to our ability to democratize, and so on. So I think first and foremost it has to become an issue. And once it's an issue, I think that there are obviously you're going to intervene in I mean, how much can we do about the inflation, for instance, that's going to come about from the devaluation of the currency? I don't know. Should we be thinking about, for instance, price caps on particular foods within Tigray so that people don't starve even more than they're starving already? What other possible interventions can we look at? Should be a discussion. It is at this time not a discussion. And I think part of the bickering and the infighting and so on is really to distract us from having those kinds of discussions. My preference, for instance, would be, I mean, to me, a GUAE that doesn't respond to these questions, that doesn't take seriously these questions, really doesn't matter to me. Like it's a useless exercise one way or the other.
Well, I
Um,
think that the GUI is a joke by all measures. I think
I
it's
don't think that Guba is a joke. I think we should be. I go back to saying it's important that we have conflict resolution mechanisms. The thing about the TPLF party organs is that people know how they function.
Mhm.
The Tigrayan body politic knows how they function. We have practice in using them for conflict resolution, however many complaints people may have of how these things, political differences have been resolved in the past, nobody picked up a gun, right? I think possibly Confagabra Matin is, as far as I know, the only victim of the differences in the late 90s and the early 2000s, for instance. Aragawi Berha is still alive, right? So um, it's very important that we have or conflict resolution mechanisms with popular buy-in, if that makes sense. And
Yeah.
it's very important that we defend these institutions until such a time as we build other institutions. And this is what I meant about projecting the future into the present. We don't have liberal institutions, right? What we have is the TPLF. That's just what it is. So these party organs are the only organs that all of the generals are familiar with, which is a very important thing. All of the generals can have buy-in to. The the body politique is very familiar with these processes. The body politique has buys into these processes. So if we lose these conflict resolution mechanisms before we have new ways, new institutions to deal with political disputes, that is a very, very dangerous thing. That could lead us to civil war. So that really needs to be taken seriously. Beyond the bickering of the politicians, we really need to be able to tell these politicians, listen, like, these institutions came at a very high cost. Yeah, these institutions came through 2 different wars. We've lost a huge amount of life to create these institutions. They are important. They are not a joke. The leadership may be a joke, but the institutions cannot be a joke. Because if they become a joke, what then happens is hugely frightening.
Well, I do from time to time follow political commentary that comes from a lot of people that I follow on social media. And one strand of thought that seems to be getting some sort of momentum seems to be that there is a belief among young people in Matala at least, that the TPLF is sort of broken beyond any redemption, that the wise thing to do now is to invite Abiy to do some sort of cleanup operation in Tigray, and somehow something good will emerge out of that. That seems to be something that people are entertaining. Abiy making you laugh. Maybe you're despairing as well. I don't know.
I mean, have you seen the state of the rest of Ethiopia when you're making that decision?
I think it's a
Listen,
case of desperate times call for desperate measures. I think that's what's going on.
I mean, the fact that they think, whoever thinks this, the fact that you think that people who, for better or worse, were part of, um, and I mean both factions of TPLF when I say this, for better or worse, were part of resistance, right? Resistance to genocide. Comparing that to the people who then committed that genocide is, in fact, I think, stupid, as you were saying. I mean, we shouldn't be using that kind of language, but it's just, that's not something that I can wrap my head around at all.
Well, I'm happy that I have tempted you into using the word stupid. It's something that you were determinedly trying to avoid.
Congratulations.
So yeah, well done on me. Yeah, but in terms of, yeah, you said that there should be a discussion about how to alleviate the suffering that would otherwise inevitably come from the new economic reforms, and I think that is a serious discussion that should be had in Tigray. And I can only wish that many people in Tigray, especially in decision-making positions, we listen to this when we publish it. I think the other discussion that needs to be had is in terms of what is the lesson that we should have learned from the experience of the war, but also from the experience of the past 3 decades. I don't think there is a consensus or agreement about what are the things that we, even with all the benefit of hindsight, what are the things that we should, by at least now, have learned.
In relation to what? Can you be more
Or in
specific?
relation to nation building in Tigray, for instance, in relation to whether or not we should have gone for, some people seem to believe that the way to go would have been to go for independence in 1991 when we had the political power, the leverage. Well, I don't know what
I
are.
mean, I think I don't want to repeat myself. I think I already responded to that question in terms of what I think the rationale for
For
remaining in
staying in
Ethiopia
Ethiopia was,
was.
yeah.
Yeah. So I don't want to repeat myself. As far as lessons learned, I think that there was part of the problem with that sort of discussion or with that kind of discourse that I've heard. Um, I'll give you an example. I remember, do you remember when people would talk about, when I say the Ethiopian government would constantly appeal to the constitution and to the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ethiopia? There is no such thing as Ethiopian sovereignty. It is the sovereignty of the nation's nationalities, right? Which means Tigray is sovereign. Ethiopia is not. Now, the fact that the right wing wanted to
Redefine sovereignty.
not redefine, the fact that they wanted to, I think, to undermine the TPLF project, the left-wing TPLF project, by saying, for instance, things like, oh, we don't have a country, we don't have a thing, then made us fall into narrative mistakes, right? What we should have been saying is that, no, we are sovereign. It is our sovereignty that is under attack, right? There is no such thing as Ethiopian sovereignty. There is the sovereignty of the nations and nationalities of Ethiopia if you are appealing to constitutionalism, which the federal government at the time was, right? The fact that we weren't able to make a legal case for ourselves because we were too busy, like, derading the left wing project is, I think, one of the ways in which it's really counterproductive. To it can sometimes become hugely counterproductive just to be like to say, um, we should have left in 91 and then that's it, you know. Okay, we didn't leave in 91. These are the legal things that we can appeal to within that. These are the institutional things that we can appeal to. Um, there is, of course, no constitutional way that the federal government could come into the region without the invitation of the regional state, right? If legality was in fact a concern, right? This is extra legal. What's happening is extra legal, right? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yep.
Um, so to the extent that Tigray had legal protect, or to the extent that Tigray could protect itself through legislation, through legality, I think there's a huge amount of protection within the constitution for the various regions, right? We could technically secede without, even at a time of war, right? That's what it says in the Constitution. Even at a time of crisis and war, you can secede, right? So to that extent, it is very well protected, legally speaking. Whether political actors care about legality is a different question, right? So in some ways, I think we mix up the trespassing of institutions with the institutions themselves, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it does. Well, I think there are a lot of strands that you mentioned that we could have gone into in detail, but we're about to run out of time. So just one
Yeah.
final point, Samhal. Um, one of the things that you have written about was your sort of displeasure at how the whole notion of Meles legacy has been misused, I would say, in Tigray by the TPLF. Am I right in saying that that is something that you're not too happy?
Yes, I think it's a lie.
Which is a lie.
I think it goes back to this thing of which program. I recently saw at the Guae or at preparations for the Guae kind of a picture of Medles with his hand up going, and we're going to continue like I, I just don't think I mean I said in that article why I think it's a lie. As I said, I think that the program was changed in the 2010s. I think, in fact, I think Dr. Fissaha from TPLF wrote an article a few months ago, if I'm not mistaken, kind of making a case
The
for
liberalization.
liberalization. Yes, more, so I don't know which program you're talking about. I don't know which Hidri, right? Like Hidri Sam'atatna. Okay, what is that Hidri? Tell me. What in fact are you protecting? What in fact am I? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because yeah, if I'm not mistaken, people who are in the TPLF, TPLF bureau now were also in the Ministry of Industry implementing ease of doing business, right? Which is like it's the neoliberal checklist. Um, so I'm not sure what ideology it is or what program it is that they are defending, protecting, and so on. It is certainly not the program as Medlis understood it. I don't think, or as I understand, Medlis understood it. Um, it's not clear to me, and it's hugely it's the kind of guilting, the way that this is being used in order to kind of guilt people into falling in line, is to me really kind of repulsive, to be honest.
What are you getting up to now in terms of your engagement in the discourse of Ethiopian and Tigrayan politics? What are you writing about? I know that you're writing a book. Maybe if you could let us in a little bit on that, and that would be our final
I mean,
question.
so the papers you've mentioned are more or less excerpts from the book.
Yeah.
The stuff that I had mentioned around historiography. So I hope to be able to continue to present those papers for interrogation and to have generative discussions around it and to keep writing it.
Well, if there's I don't know, something that you would like to say, you would like to ask yourself and to answer, that would be good. That's a good challenge. You ask yourself a
Ask
question and
myself.
yeah, that's a good challenge. Um,
Um, I don't know. I don't have any questions for myself.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah. So I think the articles that we mentioned, one with titled a Dirge for the Ethiopian Left, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Mhm.
The other one was the other paper where you discuss the structural causes that led to the war. I think that is behind a paywall, but you would remind me the.
Oh no, it's been made. It's that one's been made open access, I believe.
Oh, it's been okay. Good. So yeah, just remind our viewers so that they could read. We'll just
I've also forgotten the title of
that
that paper. I
no
think it's
that is a dereliction of
the
duty on my
interview.
part. I should have. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
one is the dirge for the Ethiopian left. The other was I think on Addis Standard, where you wrote your displeasure at how the
Oh
Meles
yes,
legacy is
the
being
legacy. Yeah.
misused. I'm going to put links to them anyway
Mhm.
under the description on YouTube. So yeah, I think as you would imagine, there are a lot of things that we could have gone into detail, and I'm going to hope that you'll make time for me another time. But for
Sure.
today, we're going to leave that at that. And
Thank you for having me.
thank
I'm
you very
sorry
much, Semhal.
as I said, I'm a better writer than I am speaker. So
Oh, I think you're a wonderful speaker.
apologies
I
for
think
my
yeah,
inarticulate
yeah.
spewings.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Semhal.
you.